Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I'm Vanessa Quirk. Eric, it was Earth Day this week. Did you do something to celebrate?
Let me think. That was Wednesday, right?
Like 4 years ago in quarantine time.
Yeah. I think I stayed in my apartment and tried not to get COVID-19.
Whoa, big change of pace.
I think that's what I did on Wednesday, yeah. The same thing we do every day, Pinky. That's where we're at. But happy Earth Day. And hello, city lovers. Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world, and we'll chat with economist Issi Romem as well. When time's up on a segment, you'll hear our little bicycle bell. This week, our top stories look at moving the homeless into hotels, reviving public transportation, and bringing tech into the real world. All right, so let's get into it here. There were several stories this week about cities trying to move homeless populations into hotels, given how vulnerable homeless shelters are right now. Now, this is a powerful idea, but it's obviously a very tough one to pull off, given all the logistics and sometimes the politics, unfortunately. Vanessa, how are cities doing so far?
So to explain why there's an imperative to do this right now. Basically, homeless shelters are not designed to prevent the spread of disease, right? There isn't enough space in shelters to keep a safe distance, to keep 6 feet apart. Many people use the same bathrooms, maybe the same, utensils, the same common spaces. And there was even a study that estimated that people experiencing homelessness are twice as likely to be hospitalized with COVID and 2 to 4 times more likely to die compared to the general population.
Wow. So the idea is that if you use hotel rooms, hotels, they don't have any customers right now. There's no tourists. No one can travel. These conditions are safer. People might have their own rooms. It would be cleaner. And I think I read that FEMA covers 75% of the costs. Plus, you can rehire some workers right now to help clean and manage the hotel. So there seems like a lot of benefit there.
Right. I mean, on the surface, it does seem like a win-win situation. Why wouldn't you go forward with this idea? And California is leading the way with it already. They have this project called Project Roomkey. They started it in early April, and other cities are following. That said, there have been roadblocks, right? And reporters have been doing a really good job of describing these roadblocks and these challenges for these programs to go forward. So this week alone, we read great reporting from Alyssa Walker and Curbed, Sarah Holder and Kristen Capps at City Lab, Catherine Kim at Vox. So, I mean, there is a lot of attention on this issue right now, and we can kind of distill their findings down to kind of 3 general challenges here. So, first of all, there is a lack of information for how people experiencing homelessness can actually access the program or even understand if they're eligible for the program, right? Alyssa Walker talks to a gentleman who luckily he had come in contact with a social worker a couple months earlier and they still had his number on file. But obviously there's a big challenge there in getting the information across, right? Secondly, local communities have opposed the idea, frankly, right? They've set up showdowns that could potentially just force states to commandeer properties as their only option to make this go forward, right?
It's NIMBYism at a different level here.
Totally. And the third challenge here is that the federal government has actually been offering advice that's kind of saying the opposite of what these projects are trying to do, right? They're saying that homeless shelters should stay open during this crisis. So those are the 3 major roadblocks that are facing these programs.
Yeah, we've had this a couple times with COVID and big political challenge where it's just a case where technology really doesn't have an answer for this, although it should be able to help connect, I think, local officials with shelter coordinators, close that information gap you were talking about. But I think, what's important to understand here is there is this need for temporary housing. It's very urgent in the sense of people experiencing homelessness right now being safe from this disease and improving public health in that sense. But it's going to be even more pervasive as this extends and we see more and more people who are unemployed as a result of the economic downturn that's come with this.
Right.
People are not able to pay their mortgages, to pay their rent. They are, unfortunately, in many cases, probably going to lose their homes as well. And so stopgap measures like this hotel program, they're extremely important But so is thinking about the more long-term needs around temporary housing. And we've talked about some of that on previous episodes too.
Why don't we talk a little bit about some of the measures that cities can take to start addressing the housing crisis with a bit more long-term vision in mind?
Yeah, we do have some tools that can help there, I think. And, one is obviously modular housing. We've talked a lot about that. There are initiatives that can deploy housing in a matter of weeks. There are, in California at least, new regulations promoting accessory dwellings, so backyard cottages, smaller dwellings. If a relative or a family member or a friend loses their home, they could move in there. You could provide special incentives and tax breaks on that over the short term. There's also, we have to remember, enormous amounts of public land or usable land near sports arenas, concert halls, convention centers that aren't going to be used for many, 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 many months. So we have space to deploy some of these temporary shelters if we need them, when we need them.
Right. And obviously those are only a couple ideas, but that's all we have time for. So hopefully that gets the ball rolling in a couple city halls there. Moving to a slightly more optimistic piece of news here. New York, San Francisco, Seattle, they're all starting to see progress in slowing the spread of COVID, which is great. It also means that these cities are starting to think about how are they going to ease restrictions and start to reopen the economy. And that, as you and I, urbanists, know, that means reviving transit, right? So Eric, you wrote a great blog post this week outlining 9 measures that could help restore faith in transit. So what's it going to take here?
Yeah, I think the baseline of what it's going to take is recognizing that reviving transit is the key here, right? We cannot do this if we rely on car traffic alone. And cars have equaled safety during COVID, right? Across America, you've seen a lot of people take to their cars. But if we do that as things start to open up, we are going to grind to a halt through traffic. There are also other drawbacks to that in terms of pollution that comes from vehicle emissions. So that is not the answer.
And especially not for these 3 cities in particular that you mentioned. I mean, San Francisco, New York, Seattle, they make up about 10% of the U.S. economy. And also they have huge shares of people who already commute by transit. So transitioning to those folks to cars is not going to work.
Yeah, you can't replace that type of movement with cars. So you have to focus on transit, and you have to implement safety measures that make it healthy for workers and riders.
Right.
And you also need to reduce crowding as much as possible, because we know we're not going to be able to achieve the types of social distancing that we optimally would on public transportation. It's just not possible. So there are some very obvious and urgent safety measures around personal protective equipment for workers, cleaning stations, cleaning subway cars and buses as much as possible. But I think beyond those, what we really need to focus on is how to shift behavior. And one of the ways I looked at is through fare incentives. So what do we mean by that is you've had a lot of cities in the last few years pilot early bird fare programs. So that just means if you are going to take public transit and you leave your house at, say, 7 a.m. instead of right before 9 a.m., the rush hour, you get a discount, or maybe you even get a free ride.
Well, that would be great for you because you're certainly an early bird.
That would be great for me. Yeah, that's right.
not so much for me.
I'm kind of the poster child of the early bird program. Hong Kong's done this. Singapore's done this. Melbourne's done this. And it has been found to shift up to 7 or 8% of riders out of the peak period, that rush hour period, and into those earlier periods. And that might not sound like a lot, but it's actually the equivalent of many, many full trains of passengers that you're moving into a different time slots. You really are easing crowding in these subway trains when you do this. So one caveat here, because the power of that program is that the early bird fare is a lot cheaper than the rush hour fare. We don't want to charge essential workers more. So if essential workers have to travel during rush hour, you don't want to penalize them for that. So right now we do have to figure out a workaround for that. And we also have to coordinate very closely with businesses too.
Right. And you do mention in the piece that, part of that coordination with businesses is working with them to figure out how to stagger work hours, right? Most businesses do 9 to 5, but why couldn't you start at 8? Why couldn't you start at 10? New York did this during the 1918 flu epidemic, and that worked pretty well. And today that should be even easier because of remote work. Like, why couldn't you just transition those hours? And you also mentioned, which I thought was interesting, the need for real-time data, right? You need to know exactly when the train's arriving so you're not dwelling at the station waiting for a train to arrive.
Right. You want to spend as little time as possible waiting in the station near bigger crowds. I mean, you generally want to do that, but you certainly want to do that at a moment like this one. Also, there's an opportunity for data to go even further and show us how full a given train or bus is before we get on board. So we can kind of distribute ourselves along the platform. We talked recently about how Barcelona started to pilot this. That technology exists. It can be done. So there are measures cities can take. Obviously, this all costs money.
Sure.
I think there is a case for implementing some sort of short-term pollution tax to help fund it. We know that pollution exacerbates COVID, so there's kind of a public health imperative there. And also, gas prices are really low right now, so it's not an extraordinary burden on drivers to have to make up some of that cost if they choose to drive instead of using transit. Obviously, electric vehicles shouldn't pay, but that's my idea.
I mean, obviously, all of this stuff is very politically difficult, but I think we both agree that the need is certainly there. And so where the need is, hopefully the political will follow.
Exactly. Even if you don't like these 9 solutions, we got to do something because we need transit to come back.
Absolutely.
All right. Our third and final top story of the week comes from the Stratechery blog written by Ben Thompson. He is commenting on a recent essay by venture capitalist Mark Andreessen called It's Time to Build. Vanessa, there is a whole lot to unpack here. Where do you want to begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we should set some context because, our tech listeners are probably super familiar with Ben Thompson and Mark Andreessen, but it's entirely possible that our urbanist audience may not be so familiar. So Mark Andreessen is the co-founder of a really well-known Silicon Valley venture capital firm called Andreessen Horowitz. And he got famous in 2011, actually, because he wrote this essay around software eating the world, right? And that was a real touchstone essay. And indeed, software has a lot of power in our economy today, right? No doubt. Right. Operating largely in the digital realm, right? Aiming for enormous profit margins, which are really only possible when you're not dealing with the kind of nitty-gritty stuff of the physical world.
I think that's a good context. And so the point now of the new essay, It's Time to Build, is that Andreessen, he's kind of bewildered that we as a society, we can't build anything real.
Right.
He's talking about masks, reagents, the swabs, all the things we know we need for testing and that we're really short of at this moment. We can't build it. But he goes beyond COVID and he's saying we're not building in a much broader sense. He even calls out cities, right? He's saying we don't build enough housing. We aren't building cities of the future. He goes into transportation. He goes into education, really goes down the line here.
Right. He's basically saying that all the innovation is not happening in the real world. It's been transplanted to the software world, right? And so Thompson, who's also very well regarded in the tech sector as an analyst and a blogger, so he takes up this idea and he says, okay, so if we want that innovation to come into the real world, if we want to build more, what does that mean? How do we go about it, right? And he kind of outlines 3 things. So the first one is that tech has to embrace distributed work. Not every tech worker, not every software engineer should have to go to Silicon Valley to do exciting, interesting work, right? And we've talked about this a little bit. We've talked about programs like Tulsa Remote, trying to spread the creative class, if you will, across the US and hopefully create hubs that are outside of Silicon Valley.
Right. People can live in a more affordable city, but still work for one of the coastal companies.
And maybe even form their own company outside of the coast, right? So that's kind of the hope of that. The second thing that Ben Thompson outlines here is that tech needs to invest in quote unquote real world companies that blend hardware and software innovation, even if the profit margins aren't always as, gigantic as they would have been in purely software endeavors. And the last one that he says is that tech needs to figure out an investing model that makes it possible to fund ideas that have a good chance of succeeding, even if they have a small chance of being this kind of unicorn runaway success.
Yeah. So I think these are great points that Ben Thompson makes, and I agree with all of them. I mean, I think what he's demonstrating is a great appreciation for the fact that changing the urban environment happens at a different speed than changing the digital world, right? And it takes a coordination too. It takes public and private sector collaboration.
Right.
It's not just one side. So, it's not like there's no innovation happening in the real world in cities.
Sure.
We should definitely point that out. These are the types of things we think about every day, right? We have mass timber construction that's emerging now. We have storage batteries and thermal grids and other types of clean energy that are really emerging now. We have telehealth systems that are emerging now. And they do face some of the hurdles that Andreessen mentions in terms of regulation and business models and the types of partnerships and infrastructure building that need to happen for these to take off. But we've seen success stories, right? Even just look at bike share, which is not a very old technology, maybe 10, 15 years old. It is exactly the type of software, hardware hybrid that Ben Thompson's talking about. But it took bold local officials to try it out. It took cycling lanes and other types of infrastructure to really make it more powerful. And it took, the evolution of a business model that's still happening in many cities to really make it work for the long term. So yes, we do need to accelerate the building here. We need to make things in the real world more quickly, but we have to understand and appreciate that balance between exploration on the public sector side and an expectation around returns on the private sector side.
Definitely. And if we have time, I'm going to read one little quote here that I thought was a nice kind of optimistic tone to end on from Ben Thompson here. We need to figure out how to build real businesses that build real things, not virtualize everything. And we need to start fighting for not just infinite upside, but the sort of minute changes in cities, states, and nations that will make it possible to build the future.
That's great.
Nice, optimistic way to end that segment. That is it for the top stories. As always, you can find the links to all of these stories in the podcast episode notes. In our next segment, we are going to talk with economist Issi Romem about an alternative to homeownership that is starting to gain popularity amidst the COVID pandemic. Back in a sec. We are now joined by economist Issi Romem. He is the founder of a think tank called MetroSite and a fellow at UC Berkeley's Turner Center for Housing. This week, he wrote a really fascinating article in the New York Times about a new home financing model that combines renting and buying. Issi, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Really glad you could join us, Issi. We are conditioned to think about homes two ways. Either you rent or you buy. And your whole point here is that there is another way forward, right? There is a hybrid model. So can you take a minute or so and explain how that works for folks who might not be familiar?
Sure. Let me start by saying that there are a variety of hybrid models from around the world that work in all kinds of different ways. The devil is typically in the details. But in our case, what I have in mind is the notion of taking someone who owns a home and having them sell a fraction of that home to some co-investor who then owns that fraction and pays the owner in cash for that. And then as the house appreciates or depreciates, both sides share in that appreciation or depreciation. And in some cases, along the way, the owner pays the co-investor something that's akin to a dividend and that can resemble mortgage interest or rent on that amount of capital that the investor has in the person's home. Now, where this becomes really interesting is, A, when this is used as a way of financing a home off the bat, someone can use it to buy a home without a mortgage. And B, when there's no intent to ever buy back that equity, and rather this is kind of a permanent way of sheltering.
You're kind of already hinting towards the advantages and disadvantages of this model, but can we focus on the advantages for now? What are the benefits of this model for tenants?
Well, there's two of them, right? And they both hinge upon the fact that you're in a much longer run setup than you are in your typical standard rental contract. Instead of having to worry about whether your landlord will want their daughter to move into your home at the end of the year when your contract is up and tell you, listen, you got to move, you are secure there for the long run the same way that a homeowner is. And more than that, financially, you have some certainty about what your housing costs will be, typically for a period of 10 years or potentially longer. And that's very different than the concerns that renters have about their rent going up each year.
So let's build on that, because as Vanessa mentioned, and as you started to allude to, there are definitely some drawbacks as well. So can you elaborate on some of the big challenges that you see here with this model?
Yeah, so let's divide this into two parts. The first is now in the context of the pandemic, this notion might have appeal to distressed homeowners. People who are out of a job and who are lucky enough to own a home may find themselves in a month or in a year in a situation where they need to sell the home in order to have cash to live off of. And that can be traumatic. Having the option of being able to sell 20, 30, 40, 50% of your home to an investor, getting cash in exchange, but not needing to move, not needing to change your life circumstances, could be an advantage. However, these people might be hard pressed, and investors might be able to take advantage of those distressed homeowners. Basically, these people may never be able to buy back their homes. If they're doing better 3 years down the line, and the housing market is doing well, then it might be very hard to buy back that share, and they could be permanently out of home ownership or out of full home ownership as a result. In the longer run, think beyond the pandemic, the question is this really a way of helping people deal with expensive housing? The advantage here is instead of having to put down the capital to buy a home in full, you're really just paying the equivalent of interest on a mortgage and not having to pay the principal to buy the equity in the home. And that means that you can get the same home that you could otherwise for a lower monthly cost. The question then is, will people take those savings and use them for something else, say investing in some other asset, or will they opt to buy more house than they could otherwise? And if everyone does this together, just raise home prices as a result in places where there's not much new housing being built. Now, if you boost demand in a market where supply is rigid, where there's not much construction happening, even when demand is high, that just raises prices. And that is likely to happen if this model is adopted large scale. Now, what should happen in that respect? How can we avoid that? We need to continue the nascent YIMBY revolution that's been starting for the last 2-3 years. And we need to make sure there's more supply. That means land use policy reform on a large scale. And it means making sure that even now, as housing affordability recedes from the headlines for the next few years, we don't forget about it and reform doesn't stop.
I'll ask you this last one, Issi, and we'll let you go. Maybe focusing right now on the short term, drawing back from that longer term. What do you think should be done with this model in terms of being able to help people who are in a real crunch right now, who maybe can't pay rent, who maybe can't pay mortgage? And we know we have to keep them in their homes, but we also have to keep the system solvent. What can we do?
I think it really is about helping people hold their breath financially. So I think solutions like forbearance or like pure handouts from the government are effective at this point. More systematically, there's a chain of money flowing between different people in housing and in all other parts of the economy. And every link in this chain is going to have trouble. Those links that collapse are the ones with the pockets that are not as deep as others. And the challenge in terms of policymakers really is in making sure that the brunt of missed payments falls on those with the deepest pockets. Those can be employers who are bigger, those can be lenders. Ideally, that's the government, but it really is about accepting that people can't pay in full and not letting that break the system.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and shedding some light on this.
This is really great. Yes, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
It is now time for our final segment, our favorite segment, The Last Smile. This is the segment where we set aside the depressing news of the week and we focus on something happy for 1 minute each. Eric, what made you smile?
Continuing with my transportation theme this week, I'll do a little house promo here for my colleague, the senior computational designer, Melly Harvey, who works with us at the New York City Sidewalk Labs office. She made a fantastic tool called the NYC Sidewalk Width tool. So basically what it is she has taken public data about the widths of sidewalks across New York City, and she's layered that onto a map, and she's used color coding to show where it is possible to achieve a proper social distance of 6 feet from another pedestrian, and where it's not possible. And it turns out there's a lot of places where it's really not possible. This is a great tool, especially for advocates who are trying to get the city to close down traffic so that pedestrians can use the streets to walk around in. So I want to give props to Melly on creating something really wonderful right now.
Yeah, and we should caveat that, Melly notes that it's not real-time data. It doesn't tell you if, there are obstructions in the path. So you shouldn't take it as gospel, but it is a very helpful tool to get a general idea of how safe it is to social distance in your New York City neighborhood.
Great point. And I should mention the URL too here. It's www.sidewalkwidths.nyc. If you want to visit that tool, it was also written up in Curbed this week, if you want to check that out. So that's what made me smile this week. What about you, Vanessa?
So as you know, and now the listeners are going to learn, I am learning the ukulele. So I've been spending a lot of my quarantine life learning new chords and everything. And I came across a really fantastic TikTok video from a music teacher who plays the ukulele, and she has composed a really powerful song that really, I think, encapsulates the feeling of life in quarantine. So rather than say more, I'm just going to play it for the dear listeners so that they can experience it themselves.
I mean, that's well said.
Yeah, really to the point, I'd say.
Wise words there from Makeshift Macaroni on TikTok. And TikTok Art Time is up this week. So thank you for joining us.
If you want to read the stories that we discussed today and many more, then sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk's company positions.
And if you think we're missing a perspective, then let us know. We've already gotten a couple emails and we'd love a couple more because maybe we could do like a mailbag episode. So Send an email, send a voice memo to podcast@sidewalklabs.com.
The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by Vanessa and me. Vanessa does the editing. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions and our art is by the great Tim Cow. See you next time.
Bye.